Hey, hello, Happy New Year. Welcome to the year 2025. One of those numbers which sounds like a distant fantasy, in the movies, in the year 2025. And yet, here we are. We get to experience it. We get to partake. Anyway, there are lots of things to do, lots of freelance to edit, to conclude, to shape, to present, and lots more of this thing that you're listening to. I'm excited to continue producing these interviews. We had 5 great ones to wrap up 2024. Please go give those a listen if you haven't. And we've got a few more in the editing stages now that I'll be releasing throughout the month of January, and then more to record and more to edit. So thank you. The Curiosity and Courage content train will continue chugging along, and I'm very grateful that you are listening and watching and sharing if that's the kind of thing that you do. Anyway, I thought let's kick off 2025 with someone who's demonstrated lots of professional curiosity and built a robust practice in figuring out what AI can mean for marketers and creatives. And that's Noah Brier. He's one of those people who learned how to ask interesting questions and never hesitated from seeking answers, even if the process might have proved difficult. I first encountered Noah because he and another guy named Piers Falks created this website called LikeMind, and that website, quite frankly, kind of changed my life, introduced me to some people who I still connect with this day. So then Noah made his way through agencies including Naked Communications and the Barbarian Group, where he led strategy for 3 years. And then he got that itch, got an idea, and he launched a platform called Percolate. Now, if you worked client side in a marketing organization between 2010 and 2019, you probably heard about Percolate. I know that we worked with it at Land O'Lakes. It was our marketing system of record. But then Noah sold Percolate, and he's jumped full-time into the realm of AI. And now he's running the BrXnd AI Conference, which is hosting its Los Angeles event, happening this coming February 6th. And he's also running the firm Alephic, which is, like many of us, trying to figure out what AI might mean and how it might be applied to all facets of creativity. So I'm excited to kick off this new year with the fascinating Noah Brier. Great. But I'd love to start with the whole what's coming up here. This is gonna air in early January. So like BrXnd LA 2025, February 6th. Like for those who are just coming to grips with all of this, what's going down? What's going to happen? Talk about what's going to transpire on February 6th.
Sure, yeah. So I'm doing an event February 6th in LA. I call it brand. It's got an X in the middle, BrXnd.ai. But I call it brand. It was never really meant to be a thing, but it has become a thing. Originally, I mean, really, it's 3 years on now. This might going to be my first time in LA. Do New York probably sometime later this year as well. But the whole spirit has been like, just let's not talk about AI. Let's show real stuff. This is, my experience with it has been, it's like the most amazing technology I've ever experienced, in that like and part of why it makes it so amazing is it just works. Like, it's not a thing where we have to imagine the future. It's not the metaverse. It's not like, it's not crypto. It's not any of these things where we're like, oh, what might happen? It's just like, there's stuff you could just do right now that is unimaginable. And when I first started it 2 years ago, I just sort of felt like, man, we're like spending too much time as an industry sitting around kind of speculating about what might happen in the future, when there's just amazing stuff you could be doing today. And how can I help create a situation where people speculate less and just sort of see real stuff more?
Well, I remember encountering, I don't remember who posted about it, but I stumbled across that first brand AI event that you did, and I watched Tim Wang's talk, and then it was it might have been Rafa Jimenez was talking about the Turing test, the AI ad Turing test. And that blew my mind, because it's like, wait, you're right. You could do this. You could entirely like create a process. And it was a little bit cumbersome back then. And now we're seeing tools that, "Hey, you want an ad? Here you go." From the outside, I benefited so much from just the conversation and the way that people were kind of framing things, and to realize, oh, I'm not alone. Oh, there are other people out there thinking about these problems in interesting ways. So I appreciate you putting it on, and hopefully I'll get to your New York event in 2025.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that my whole point with it, and continues to be my whole point with it, is um, that this is just a sort of amazing creative accelerant. And like, uh, certainly we can think about it, we can be worried about it, we should think about the implications of it, but also we just got to play with it and just like
Yeah.
mess around with it and see what happens. And I think even talking about the ad Turing test, the kind of big takeaway from that was like, uh, when you take people with a tremendous amount of experience making ads, um, and you give them amazing tools, they can make pretty good ads. And we got them scored by System One, and like so we did creative testing on them, and they scored above the industry average. And
Yeah.
it's like that the models on their own couldn't come close to that. They couldn't even sort of spit an ad out at that time. Um, and even now they can't really spit an ad out on their own, right? Like, you have these tools that could do it, sort of combine a bunch of models together and do a bunch of stuff. Um, but
But
yeah,
it still requires a human, right? It still requires a human kind of instigating, and it requires a human kind of poking and prodding, and maybe even curating to get to, we're not yet in an age where an AI is going to wake up, have a cup of coffee, and I'm going to go make some ads. No.
yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe we will be at some point. I sort of part of my rule for the conference is like no talk about AGI, because just don't think anybody has any idea, and so it just doesn't. It's not a thing that I just don't care. Like, I mean, I guess I care about it theoretically, but like it's not a thing I use any of my own brain cycles on.
Right. So it, you strike me as a very busy entrepreneur, right? You started this AI conference. You just started Alefic. Is that how you pronounce it? Alefic?
Prolific, yeah.
Alefic? Like, where did that come from? Where did the entrepreneurial inspiration come from?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, my whole
Were your
sort of
parents entrepreneurs,
entrepreneurial
or?
no, my entrepreneurial journey really started in, um, I started building things. I taught myself to write code in 2008, and I just
Mhm.
started sort of making things. One of the first things I made was this thing called brand tags. It flashed up a random logo, and people typed in the first thing that popped into their head, and it made a
Mm.
tag cloud out of the results. So it was sort of a snapshot of brand perception, and that gave me the bug for just making stuff. And I was pretty naive to starting a company when we started Percolate in 2011. Uh,
Right.
and
But even earlier, like, I'm thinking about like mind. And what you don't know is that I had moved to back to Minneapolis. I had been living in Boston and New York, and I moved back to Minneapolis in 2006. And I hadn't lived in the market for 20 years. And so I knew like one or two people from, like high school, but I really didn't know the scene. And someone had mentioned, "Hey, there's this thing called Like Mind." And I remember going to that portal for Minneapolis and discovering, oh, there's a group of people who are interested in, marketing and advertising, meeting at a coffee shop tomorrow morning.
yeah.
And I went to this meetup, and there's a guy that I met at that. He's one of my best friends today. So
Oh,
thanks to you, Greg is one of my best friends.
I'm very happy to hear that. I love those stories. Yeah, I mean, the funny thing, some of this stuff has just happened. It's like mine was not, there was no plan.
Yeah.
It was the story behind like mine was Piers Fox, who runs psfk.com, and I had wanted to meet for a long time, and then finally we set a time to meet in the West Village, which was near where I worked and he lived, and we were like, what if we invited some other people? So we put it up on our blogs, and it became a thing, and then um And then some people were like, "Hey, can we also have a like mind?" And we are like, "You mean like invite a bunch of people for coffee?" And they were like, "Yeah," and we were like, "Yeah, that sounds sure you can." And you know, the thing we did with that actually is we just had these sort of ground rules that were pretty kind of. So you had to do it in the morning. It had to be no agenda, unmoderated. It had all these things. It had all these rules attached to it that were just kind of we felt like were the right way to do it. One of the funny stories actually out of that is um, Creative Mornings, which runs out of Brooklyn. Um, if I remember correctly, I think originally they were thinking about doing a like mine, but they wanted to do it in a more sort of organized fashion. And we were like, I don't know, that's not really what we do. We don't do agenda and a speaker and everything. We just had a show for coffee, and I think that's how it became Creative Mornings, if I recall correctly. So yeah, it's funny to think about that as entrepreneurial. I mean, I guess it is entrepreneurial, but it was more like, um, uh, it was just a thing that sort of made sense to me. And I guess more than anything else, the sort of, I feel like if there's anything that is my sort of real, like, origin story of following my own curiosity, it's, um, when I was a middle schooler, I had a teacher who, before the winter break, um, he would ask every year the whole class. This was a social studies class in 7th or 8th grade. He'd ask the whole class this question about the XYZ affair, which was this sort of situation that happened between France and the United States in the late 1800s, if I remember correctly. It was this kind of weird diplomatic situation, and X, Y, and Z were the sort of pseudonyms for these people who were involved, and it was a whole sort of there were bribes and there was all this stuff, and anyway, the teacher would ask this question: Who was the woman that accompanied the three men X, Y, and Z to this dinner? And he had been asking for like 20 years, and the deal was if you got it right, that you got an A for the whole quarter. You didn't have to do any work. You didn't have to take a test. You just like stick your feet up on the desk and not do anything, and you just had an A, and nothing mattered. And if you're like 12 and in middle school, that sounds like a really amazing deal.
Yeah. And,
Fantastic.
I'm up for that challenge.
Yeah. And so, and it was over like a vacation, and I went home, and you had to come in. You couldn't just have the answer. You had to actually have the source material along with it. Try to encourage us to do research. So I went and I sort of like looked all around, and I had my parents drive me to these libraries, and I tracked down all of these different books, and I sort of eventually found the answer, and the answer was in this book published in like the early 70s, but I just couldn't sort of sort out why the later books. So there was a book that had been published in the mid 80s, which was like this sort of authoritative volume on what had happened. And I couldn't, and it didn't mention her. And I thought that was so strange that it didn't mention her. So I had the answer, but for some reason, and to this day, I have no idea what that reason is. I was not satisfied with that answer. And so I got it in my head that I was gonna call the person who wrote the book, and I'm 12, and I was gonna, like, ask him if, why he didn't have the answer to this, and my thought was that I'd just, like, leave a message and ask him to send my dad an email, because my dad had the email address, and I was like, "Could you?" And so I get on the phone. He's a professor at Syracuse. I like find the phone number for the history department at Syracuse University, and I call and ask for this guy, and I just get put through to him, and he answers the phone. I sort of like am 12 and stumbling through and try to explain that my history teacher has asked this question, and he was like, "Oh, your history teacher is completely incorrect." And I know that because I'm the one who prove that this woman was never there. And I can point you to the source material, which you should be able to find in the Yale University Library, because I grew up in Connecticut. Um, and uh, and at the end, I was just like, can you like also just write all this down for me in an email so I can like handed to my teacher. And so I go, my mom takes me to Yale. I find the book in the library. I make a copy of it, and then I get to school that Monday, and I'm in line. And I'm the second person in line, because it's like whoever gave it to him first got the A. And so I'm the second person in line. So the first person in line gives him the correct answer, and so he's sort of like, hey, everybody, that's it. Like, she's got it. You all did a great job, I'm sure, but it was the first person, and I'm like, oh, I think I got something else for you. And so I give him this letter and I give him the source material, and I'm like, I think that you're wrong. And I think you've been wrong he had been asking for 15 years at that point. And I think you've been wrong for 15 years. And he looked at it and he couldn't believe it. And I just think about that story a lot, in that, like, I kind of feel like my whole life, I don't know, it's like a little bit of a chicken or the egg thing, but I kind of feel like my whole life has been just an openness to following those strange gut feelings when things don't add up, or you can't quite figure something out, and just sort of going down the rabbit hole. And that is still my sort of favorite that's my favorite rabbit hole story. But it kind of feels like, even everything I've done in the industry, everything I've learned along the way has just been it's been one rabbit hole after another.
Exactly, right? And I think that's such a hallmark of entrepreneurs in general, but especially the business of being a creative person, right? Like, you get hired, if you realize it, to go down rabbit holes quite often, and to kind of either figure out an insight, or find an idea, or look at a problem that's been a consternation for forever. No one's been able to figure this out, but all of a sudden it's your turn, and you wind up at the Yale library, or you have the guts to call some stranger who picks up the phone, by the way, right, and agrees to talk to you even though you're 12. Like, that's so great. I love that. That's a fabulous story. It's perfect. We were talking about LA and the brand thing. Like, what's going to happen in LA? Like, who's going to be there? What could an attendee expect from the experience?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I have a set of programming tenets that I've been big. I think after I did the first one, I kind of wrote down the things I felt like worked really well. So, some of the things you can expect is no panels, because I hate panels. So conversations, I think, are really powerful, and we have one-on-one conversations, but I think generally panels are a good way to get a lot of people on stage and not say a lot. So
Agreed.
don't have
Yeah.
any of those. Um, when people demo things, it's always stuff. So it's a lot of demos. It's a lot of people seeing things that I think are interesting, that
Right.
critically you can go use tomorrow. And that,
Mm.
when people are speaking, either they're sort of experts. So we have, somebody coming from LangChain, talking about agents and sort of how agents work and what the truth is. I was sort of joking with him this morning that his talk should be titled WTF of Agents. Um, so, I think, but also, anyone who's talking is not expected to have all the answers. Like, that's okay, because I don't think anybody. And I've tried as much as possible to kind of encourage folks to um, talk about the journey, not the sort of end state. I think that's fine. Like, if we have the CMO of Zillow coming, and it's like, we don't need when we don't need him to talk about sort of all the amazing AI stuff, because everybody is at a different point in their journey. I think I'm most interested in understanding kind of like, what are, how do you talk to your team about this? What are the concerns that they have? How do you sort of help them think about that? How do you think about prioritizing? It's like, 'cause there are more questions than answers right now. And I think
Hmm.
that's really positive. But I
Yeah.
think generally at most events, the incentive is to pretend you have all the answers.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I just want generally, I think part of the fun has been, these things have been just a very different feel. And so, hopefully gonna continue on with that. And we have a pretty good mix of brands and technologists, and um, just smart people.
So let's think about, you mentioned the word difference, and I'm thinking about the internet arise and kind of threw the whole realm of marketing and advertising up in the air. And then, mobile and social occurred and brought their own kind of affect onto this industry and this business. And now as we say, AI is here. I'm just curious from your perspective, like why is AI different? And I'm asking because I distinctly remember diving all in on, building websites. I built my first one in like 94 and code and seeing like, oh wow, I could see where the potential was. And the same with social. And yet plenty of people just said, oh no, thanks. I'm gonna sit over here and keep doing things that I'm gonna follow the status quo with the internet and then with social. It feels to me like AI is so immersed in every nook and cranny of our lives and so transformative that I don't think you can sit on the sidelines. And do you agree? Like, where do you see what is the difference as technologies go with AI versus, say, where we were at with mobile and social or even the internet?
I think the fundamental answer is, this is a new computing paradigm. And I
Mm,
think that sounds like a lot of BS words, but, in truth, like, what makes AI so different is that we have all always existed in a world where computers are deterministic machines, right? Like, they do math, and they do math perfectly every time, very quickly, very perfectly. And they follow instructions. They're deterministic in the sort of pure sense of, everything is written as there are sort of pre-laid deterministic paths, right? Uh, and AI, and particularly these large language models, but AI in general is a sort of probabilistic approach to problem solving, right? Like in that, I think not everyone realizes it when they're using it, but, when you're talking to ChatGPT or Claude or any of these things, you put in an answer, you put in a prompt, right? You ask it a question, you put in a document, whatever it is. What it gives you back is essentially a sort of set of probabilistic next tokens, which it's completing, right? So, the example I always give is like if you type in the quick brown and you ask it to finish it, it'll say fox, right? And it could say a whole bunch of things, but it knows probabilistically fox is the best answer to that question, right? So um, one of the first things people noticed with AI was that it couldn't do math, right? That you would ask it a math question, it would sort of look good, right? Like the example I always show is that you give it, a 5-digit number times a 6-digit number, and it gives you something that is sort of like the first 2 digits and the last 2 digits are correct, but in the middle it's wrong, right? And that's because it's not doing deterministic math. Now, there's a separate step of this where we hook it up to calculators and things like that, and it's totally capable of doing that, but let's skip that for a second. So I think first and foremost, what's different about this is it's just different, right? Is that like fundamentally, we have all lived in a world, we have a lot of intuition built up for what it means to use a computer, and as that is a deterministic device, right? This is a decision that was made 70 years ago, and where, it's deterministic. It always gives us the same answer to the same question, right? When you grab a file, it always comes back as the same thing. We're used to all of these sort of paradigms of deterministic computing, and one day we wake up and there's this thing that just flips it all on its head, right? Like
mm,
that all of a sudden, you get a different answer every time you ask it. It can't do math. But on the flip side, it can write you a poem. Right. And you imagine, like, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I say, like, hey, Tim, can you have your computer write me a poem? You just
right.
like, not only like,
Yeah.
you would just look at me strange, right? Like, that just, like, makes no sense. There's not even that's a completely nonsensical request at that time. So I think that's the sort of first piece of it that people are still wrapping their head around. And I also think this is why this is such a sort of long journey, is that we can't underestimate how weird that is. Like, that is such a strange, strange thing to experience, right? That, like, And you know, my story of that is, I think the moment where this all clicked for me was like 2 years ago. I got access to build a ChatGPT plugin. So plugins were the precursor to GPTs, and they were a way to sort of call out to another system. And they were actually the precursor to actions within GPTs, and they were a way to call out to another system and have that system return data back that you could use in ChatGPT. And um, I've had a job over the last couple of years where I get to do whatever I want at any time. I was sort of taking a break from a lot of other stuff. And so I just canceled all my meetings for the day and I just started working on building a ChatGPT plugin. And I've built lots of integrations. I've written a lot of code. And generally, the way you integrate two systems together is you go to the docs and you look at the docs and it tells you how should you send data to that system and how should you receive data back? How will you receive data back? And so I go to read the docs for this and it tells me, oh, the way you do it for us is you put a file in the root directory of your application, and in there you describe how you're going to send us data at ChatGPT and how you want us to send you data back, and we'll deal with the rest. So we'll do all the translation. So it's like I was like, "Oh, like, this is counterintuitive in this really fundamental sense, like, not casually counterintuitive." This is like, I have a career of intuition built for how to integrate systems together, and this is exactly the opposite of that intuition, right? My intuition is the big guy decides how data needs to be, sent and received, and as long as you follow their instructions to exactly the letter, then everything will work. And they're saying, no, actually, it's exactly the opposite. We'll do whatever you want and we'll just deal with the rest. And we can do that because AI can be this translation layer to make anything fit into anything else. Right. And so that was the moment where I was like, oh, of course, like the reason everybody is sort of grappling with this and they're trying to figure out what's going on and they can't sort of wrap their head around it and we can't like linearly project what it's going to do to the world is because we have no intuition for it. Like we just fundamentally don't understand the world. And the funny thing is like even the people who build the models don't understand it because the building of the models, like the writing the code to build the models is still it's deterministic code. It goes out and it runs this non-deterministic process, right? It like pulls in all this data and then it builds all these weights and it does all these things and at that point, it becomes a probabilistic machine, but it's not a probabilistic machine before that. And so it's just we're all kind of like just feeling our way along. And you know, that's also why I just sort of get a little crazy at all these sort of conferences and people and speakers and everybody who wants to be like, you know, this is how you do it, or like, you know, you're falling behind. It's like, come on, guys, like this is crazy. This is the weirdest thing any of us have ever experienced. Like we've been living in a world for 70 years where computers were deterministic machines and all of a sudden now they're not. Like this is different. This is not like casually different. And you know, the web was big, but it still existed within that other paradigm.
Mhm.
This is just strange, man.
I agree, and it's like that's to a large extent, like what Ethan Mollick has been saying, in his writing, it is, hold on, like we can't think about AI using the habits or preconceptions that we learned, that we were born with, that have existed around us, and so the people I see who are having, call it success, or at least not a lot of frustration with AI, are folks who have a very open mind and are very kind of like, I don't have an expectation about what the result will be. I'm more curious to just have a conversation with this system and see where it might lead, you know? And and that is an interesting set of habits because if computation was deterministic, and then you start thinking about, you built a company predicated on a deterministic computer system that also is kind of based on the way that agencies and service companies function, which was sort of deterministic. Like now, all of a sudden, this probabilistic way of thinking about computers is also affecting how we think about cultures and operations and supply chains and I do that's where I feel like the AI its influence on everything else is probably where the real transformation is going to occur.
Yeah, totally. And it's just gonna take time. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that, like, my other big takeaway, I remember after I did the first conference, and then a year later, I was doing the second one, and I was sort of reflecting on the last year. And I think the thing I was most wrong about is I thought, like, I was like, "I don't see how the entire industry doesn't, like, figure this out in the next 6 months." Like,
Right.
I don't even know if I'm gonna need to put on another one of these conferences because
Right.
it just seems like this is gonna happen so fast. And it's just a good reminder that, it's like, um, things take time, man. I mean, I don't know, like, not only do they always take time, do they always take time when you're working with some of the biggest brands in the world, when you're working with some of the biggest companies in the world, but they also just, like, it takes time for us, our brains to, like, reroute themselves around something totally new and different. And,
Mm.
the vast majority of people haven't spent any time playing with it. And they've,
Right.
you put in your first question to ChatGPT. And again, if you ask it a question that a traditional computer is already good at, it's probably going to give you a disappointing answer, right?
Yeah.
Or then people give it a question that, like, they can't judge the answer to, right? So it's like,
Right.
write me a poem. It's like, okay, well, that looks like a poem. Like, I don't have any opinion on it, right? Like, and so, yeah, this is all just, it's a journey. I totally also understand why some people are worried about it, right? Like, people will lose their jobs. There are
Right.
things that are gonna happen, but, yeah, I think, it's, when you deal with something fundamentally counterintuitive, you sort of just have to get on it and go. Like, I kept trying to search for the best analogy, and I had all these, like, I have, like, a graveyard of AI analogies. One of them was, imagine AI as, like, going to IKEA and you get a big box. You just walk in, you get this box, and you go home. And then when you go home, you sort of type something into the side of the box. So you're like, actually, I want this to be like a melon bed. And then, it gives you the instructions, and all the pieces in the box can be rearranged into the mountain bed. And then somebody else takes that same box home and they can make it into a bookshelf or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And it was sort of like it was overcomplicated. And then one day, I was watching YouTube with my kids, and, watching this channel called Veritasium, and he's a science YouTuber, and he built a bike that locks out left if you're trying to turn right, and locks out right if you're trying to turn left. And, he was proving the point that you actually turn the opposite way when you ride a bike. So when you
Mm.
turn a bike left, you actually have to turn it right first, and if you can't do that, you fall over. And so
Mm.
in the video, there's a grown man trying to ride a bike and he keeps falling over when he just going very slowly, trying to turn
Yeah.
left, but it's locked to not go right, and he falls over, right? And the point is that, riding a bike doesn't work the way you think it should. It's not right. It's not driving a car, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
driving a car is intuitive. You point the wheels in the direction you want them to go, and they go that direction. That is not how a bicycle works, and that's why, you have kids. I'm sure they've gotten on a
Yeah.
bike at some point. They've probably fallen off a bike at some point. That's why you don't sit your kids down and explain the physics of the bicycle before they get on the bike, because it doesn't make any sense. Like, none of it makes sense. And so, but then once you ride it, it's like riding a bike, right? And you get a
Right.
feel for it, and you don't think ever again about turning right before you turn left, although maybe you will now. But, like,
Right.
that's just how it works. And I think that's the best analogy, right? Is like,
Yeah.
we're all dealing with this thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to us. It's weird. It's, like, really, really weird. Um, and we just have to kind of get on it. And then, you try these things, and some of them work and some of them don't work. And then, you figure out your own sort of feeling for what it is. And, you just find your way through.
So now if you could just connect that to the Steve Jobs bicycle of the mind,
Right.
concept, there you go. So, um, you had mentioned like uh, growing up and kind of discovering, I guess I'm trying to figure out like, where did your sense of like inquiry come from? Did you did you grow up amongst, uh, a family that was always asking questions of things? Was it just innate? Um, where that kind of like, how do you see your sense of self and like what caused you to be you?
Yeah, I think part of it, I mean, I think it's probably a little bit of both, right? Like, I think I certainly grew up in a house where it was encouraged to ask questions. And, I think I went to a Bank Street elementary school, and Bank Street is a sort of like uh, progressive education approach that came out of Columbia. It's very interdisciplinary. It's sort of related. It's in the kind of same realm as Montessori and some of those other things. And I've always felt like, um, the real thing about all those philosophies is that fundamentally they see kids as um, full vessels, that your job as an educator is to not empty them, not as empty vessels, and your job as an educator is to fill them, right? And so it's like, they've all got their own flavor. Montessori has a different flavor than Banks. They're all a little bit different. But fundamentally, I think they see children as these incredible beings, right? And that like your job is to try to keep them incredible, not to like add a bunch of stuff to them. And, sure, you have to teach them math and teach them to read. But like job number one is like keep them curious and keep them exploring and keep them, on the path that they're already naturally on.
Yeah.
And I think I certainly think being in a place like that it was a public school, just like a regular place. But I just got lucky to be in a sort of amazing environment where, it's like, I have this memory of being in kindergarten, and I was sort of messing around one day while we were doing like math with these rods where you sort of like do counting. And the teacher came over. She saw I was like not doing what I was supposed to do. And she was like, you could just flip the book over and do it from the back. And I was like, oh, that's kind of crazy. And so I flipped it over, and it went easiest to hardest. And so I went hardest to easiest. And, she was just it was kind of my message from that was like, well, you just like it's okay to just do it the way you need to do it.
Yeah.
I think generally, I've been pretty lucky to be able to get away with that. And I've certainly sort of sought out situations. I think
Yeah.
to your question about, it's like I'm still an entrepreneur at this point, partially because I just don't think I'm employable. I think I'm not sure that my particular attitude towards this, I think it's become so solidified in my question of authority and of everything else, that I'm not sure that me working inside somebody else's company is a good idea at this point.
So what provoked you into marketing and advertising and design, and like how did you were at Naked Communications, and then you met Ben and Rick and Robert um at the
The
Barbarian
barbarian.
Group. Like how did that happen?
That was it. Well, it was all an accident. This is the theme, is like I just sort of do things. I haven't. I have never had a specific long-term plan. So, I graduated from NYU, um, and I got a job as a writer for a magazine, a very small B2B magazine called American Demographics. It's a trade publication. And, uh, I got that job in a kind of crazy way, which is I met the editor and I pitched him a story, and he was like, "If you write that story for me and it's good enough to run, I'll pay you for it and give you a job."
Yeah.
And I was like,
Awesome.
"Okay." So I was in my senior year
Game
of
game on.
yeah. So I was in my senior year of college, and it was a story about shepherd fairy and obey giant, and sort of alternative um routes to brand building.
Oh, yeah.
And so I wrote that story. I ended up getting the job. And then I was a journalist for 7 months, and then they announced they were selling the magazine. It was owned by a big holding company called Prime Media, and they were selling the whole magazine group, and so we were all going to lose our jobs. So then I started looking for a new job. But one of the advantages to being a journalist is generally you get to talk to pretty senior people, and so I sort of wrote to a bunch of people who I had found interesting that I had interviewed along the way, and asked if they wanted to hire somebody who knew how to write. And one of I got an email back from a guy named Drew Nizer who ran an agency called Renegade. And he said he had a copywriting job open. I didn't know what a copywriter was, but I went to interview for it, and I got hired. And that's how I ended up in marketing. And I'd been writing about marketing. I'd been thinking about marketing, but that sort of specifically. And then, yeah, from there, I got interested, and then it was sort of just one thing after another. So while I was at Renegade, I got to know the guy who ran strategy, and I got really interested in strategy stuff. I just thought it was cool and interesting, and I didn't know anything about the real advertising world, and so then I was like, I think I want to do strategy. So then I actually through LikeMind, I had gotten connected with some folks who were over at Naked, and then when I was at Naked, I started writing code and building things, and then I was like, I think I want to like do strategy closer to where things get built. And so then I ended up at the Barbarian Group and doing digital. Started the strategy department there. And then, yeah, after that, I had this idea for Percolate. So, um, James, my co-founder, and I started that in 2011.
Yeah, so Percolate, remind the audience or the listener of like, because I've been a customer of and the user of, and like, what was the problem you were trying to solve?
Well, originally, the problem we were trying to solve was completely different than what we ended up solving. So the original thing that we were building, that I had built for myself, was this tool that went and looked at a whole bunch of links from Twitter and from
Mm,
blogs,
mm,
and it found the most common links. So it sort of fed you a digest of all the most interesting things going on within your networks, and it had these tunable algorithms, and so you could sort of figure out, um, exactly how you wanted it to work, and in the very early days of Percolate, we were actually selling that product to brands to help them create more content. So the bet was like, "Hey, brands are gonna need to create more content as social media begins to explode." And then the product really evolved from there. So eventually what it became was we called it the system of record for marketing. And fundamentally it was sort of a content marketing workflow tool. And so
yeah.
with these big global brands, and it was, meant to be a sort of single place where you could move from, brief to content to even execution and publishing. So, that was eventually sort of what it had become. And, we made a pretty big bet in that space. And we sold the company in 2019, so it all worked out okay. But, uh
Well, specific to that, because I'm thinking about like, at the time I was working at Land O'Lakes, and we were a Percolate customer, and I can't remember if you came to visit or at some point or not, but I'm thinking about the process of creative briefing, and I remember that one of the frustrations I had with just marketers in general was this notion that a brief was kind of like a Mad Lib, like just fill it in, and essentially the system would then just the human would just output, the tactic.
Yep.
So, they saw the creative brief as this mechanism that just kind of jumped over actual creative people
Yep.
and just resulted in like, here's a banner ad or a social post. And what I appreciated about Percolate was that it sort of um uh stopped people in their tracks, as it were, in terms of like kind of requiring them to think,
Yeah.
lack of a better term. And I'm just curious about like how you came to think about the briefing process as you were, implementing a piece of software that started to get used by a lot of different organizations,
Yeah.
you know?
Um, yeah, I think fundamentally my sort of thought around Percolate and was that there were just really interesting opportunities throughout the marketing process to add some sort of operational rigor
Mhm.
that, like, um marketing for a long time had been able to kind of like just fly below the radar of the rest of the organization's requirements to, systematize the ways that they work. And that
Right.
in some ways that's really positive that like marketing had this sort of creative freedom. But in other ways that like it was kind of a crutch that wasn't actually really helpful. Like in these cases where it's like, you know, you have these, artifacts that, like, nobody really cares about. They just sort of exist to exist. And my thought forever has sort of been like, if something exists, you should care about it, and if you don't care about it, it shouldn't exist, right? And so
Mhm.
it's like in the case of the briefs, like, if you really care about briefs and you care about the way people do them, and you say you have this format, then care about it, right? And let's,
Yeah.
like, actually make sure people put effort into them. And if
Yeah.
you don't care about it, that's totally cool, but just stop pretending to care about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure we totally succeeded in that because I would say that like in many cases, what ended up was, you just took the format that either people cared about and they didn't put the effort in, or they didn't really care about, but they still put it in as a template.
Yeah.
But that's very much like and it's still my thought about kind of running organizations and marketing in general is like, there are parts of the process that really matter, and there are parts of the process that don't really matter.
Yeah.
And being really clear on what those are and how you want to do that. I mean, this is sort of like jumping ahead a little bit, but it's like, we've been doing some work recently with some brands and helping to take sort of strategy and encode it into tools using AI so
Mhm.
that they can. And the idea that I think is really powerful is like, if you care about this enough that you decided to like make this your brand strategy on a go forward basis,
Yeah.
then that should mean you want people to follow it, right? And if it doesn't mean you want people to follow it, that's totally cool, but, like, just don't pretend that's what it means. But if it does, then why don't we give people tools to help them understand whether the things that they're thinking about are aligned with the
Mm.
decisions that you made? What I didn't expect to happen from that's been very interesting to watch it actually in action inside these enterprises is that where the tool has the most value actually is as this sort of objective voice. It's like it becomes the voice of our best selves, right? It's like,
Mm.
we make these decisions about how a brand should behave in these moments when we don't have the external pressures of time or like, the CMO says they really want to do this thing or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And so we make these decisions and then you take that and you encode it into something. It doesn't mean you can't follow it, but it's really nice to have this sort of objective measure where, when we ran this for the first time with the brand that we worked with most recently on a version, um, it in their case, it was scoring things, on a 12-point scale based on they have this whole framework, and it scored a 12-point scale. And, something that a lot of people were really excited about got a 2 out of 12,
Mm. Yeah.
and it was totally right. And it gave everybody this thing that allowed them to have a conversation that they needed to have. It doesn't mean you can't do it. You can do something that goes against your strategy. You are humans with agency. The AI is not saying to do something or not do something. But
Yeah.
like you should acknowledge that you're doing something and maybe you should update the brand, right? Like if this is so
Yeah.
important to you, like maybe it means that you weren't right 6 months ago or 6 years ago or whatever it was, and
Yeah.
that brand strategy and all of these ideas about what the brand is should be updated, and that just sort of idea generally of, like, if you care about something, you should actually care about it. Otherwise, stop pretending you care about it. I think that's, like, my overarching philosophy on how to do marketing.
But now apply that to AI as you've described it, or government, or any sort of power-based system that has a lot of subjectivity in it in terms of like, well, what's the right way to interpret the rules or the law? I love the concept that there is this sort of unaligned entity or force that can very quickly look at a concept or a suggestion or an idea or proposal and just give you a kind of, you know, I don't want to use the word bias, but give you a perspective on it. And like as you say, we can all look at it and go, well, we disagree, and we're entitled to, and we can go off in a different direction. But it's this notion of kind of removing so much human subjectivity from why today the brand is over in the left field and tomorrow it's over in the right field. Why? Because humans are involved and we're emotional, and the decision maker was tired or upset
Yeah.
or distracted, and the notion of an AI kind of helping you just maintain a consistency to like, as you say, the AI is essentially saying like, hey, if this is what you guys believe, um, then this idea is a 2 and the other idea is a 10. And you talk about the transformational like nature of technology that can kind of help us be more true to ourselves, maybe,
Yeah.
you know?
I always
Wow.
think about like, I have sort of very mixed feelings about behavioral economics at this point, but I remember
Mm,
reading an article about behavioral economics years ago. And it's sort of, the kind of one of the fundamental arguments in behavioral economics is that we sort of don't put enough value on the future, right? It's like
correct. Yeah.
like tomorrow we're gonna, exercise and eat healthy, but today it's just like one more hamburger and a milkshake. And I think like that's very human nature. Like we all sort of do that. And yeah, I think there's something fundamentally interesting about like kind of trying to hold yourself accountable to those things. And then on the flip side, I think what's really necessary, and I have not built one of these yet. I've talked to some brands about it, and I'm hoping that we get the opportunity. Is like I also think the idea of like building living brand guidelines gets really interesting. So it's like the flip side of this is it gives you a 2 out of 12. You're like, no, this is right. And
Mm,
then you update the guidelines to account for it. Because
right.
I've had some, like, really funny AI moments where, we built a tool alongside a copywriting tool alongside a brand, and, in one of the early iterations of it, we took all their sort of copy guidelines, and we plugged it in, and then we ran it against the copy lines that were coming out, and, it kept telling us that, like, all these copy lines were not on brand. And I was like, "This seems like some of the feedback was, like, very weird." And so then I plugged in the existing they gave me like, we got the best performing copy lines, and we
Mhm.
plugged those in because I was like, "I just wanna see, like, what the AI thinks about the actual best performing" that the brand had put out in
Yeah,
March,
yeah, yeah.
and it said all of those were off brand.
Mm,
And I was like, "Oh, right."
okay.
Like, there's a lot of there's a lot of nuance here. This is why, like, good creatives are good, is they find the thing, but also we should go back. We don't ever go back and update it, right? So, like, these voice guidelines that they have, they were written whenever they were written, and you have these amazing writers who are doing this amazing work, and
Yeah.
it's resonating, and nobody goes back, and so the rules technically say that all the work is off brand, right? But it's
Right.
definitely not.
Yeah. Yeah. The rules say everything should be in third person, but it's evolved into first person and it's performing really well. Like someone needs
And
to
it
go
feels
back and
right, and
yeah,
everybody's
yeah.
happy, and, like yeah, and it's fine, like, we can go back and change, but we don't ever go back and edit those things, and so I just have this idea that I really want to create a system where, like, you monitor the things that actually go out, and then you
Mhm.
sort of make suggestions to go back in all the time and say, "Hey, like, are you really sure this is still your voice guideline? 'Cause, like, you keep putting out all this stuff that sounds more like this, and, like, you sure you don't wanna tweak it a little bit? Because I don't think you're either, like, all of this stuff is off brand, or all of this stuff is on brand and your guideline is wrong."
Right. And have a system that would say like, "Hey, I notice of all the work you're putting out there, this stuff is converting or performing really well, and I'm noticing a disconnect with the rules that you've created." Like, and so the notion of AI enabling kind of a living style guide that listens and recognizes that culture shifts, and so creativity shifts and brands shift, do it, man. That's a gift to the world. So you've worked alongside it and like collaborated with all sorts of wonderful creative people. And when you think about designers and technologists and writers, like what distinguishes the ones that are at the top of their game? What are the habits or the skills or the behaviors that you would point out?
They're just open-minded and fun to talk to. They come I mean, like, the very, very best, like, the sort of very small list of people who I would put at the top of my, like, "Hey, I wanna come up with a new idea." Like, I need somebody to sit down with, like, it never stops, right? They're just sort of, like, always pushing in different directions. They never put a stop to anything. Um, uh they have sort of fairly expansive in their thinking. They're not kind of constrained by any specific set of ideas. Like, one of my favorite articles of all time, I actually got the chance to republish this for my newsletter. Why is this interesting? Was from Michael Beirut, who's one of the partners at Pentagram. And he wrote a piece called Warning May Contain Non-Design Content. He wrote it for his Design Observer, I think, back in 2004, 2005 or something. And uh, in the piece, basically, the piece was written because all these people were commenting on the blog that they were like, Michael, you never talk about design, because he was writing about poetry, or he was writing about theater, or he was writing about art. And, he wasn't writing about the latest identity refresh or whatever. And he wrote this piece, and, the sort of punchline of the piece is basically like, well, design isn't about design. It's about art and theater and culture and all of these other pieces. And like, actually, in many ways, design piece of it, the last step in that entire puzzle is sort of it's like the least interesting of all of it, right? Like, all of this other stuff is so amazing, and that's where all the inspiration is, and that's where all the ideas are, and that's where all of everything is.
Yeah.
And, like, to kind of close yourself off to only the end is just silly. And I've always thought, like, he was writing about design, but I've always thought, like, marketing and just about everything else that sort of having to do with creativity, that's true, right? Is like, whatever it is, that's the kind of very last piece. You've got a wall full of books behind you, right? Like, those are the raw materials that make up the creativity. And so yeah, I mean, I think I think to me it's that. And I also just think, like, surrounding yourself with people who just make stuff. Like, I think that
Mhm.
people who get going, I mean, like, Benjamin Palmer, who I worked for when I was at Barbarian Group, and is, without a doubt, one of the sort of most incredible creatives I've ever worked with. Um, I mean, it's like he one day just started making these crazy Photoshop montages. And it's like a, pastoral scene, but there's a helicopter landing, and then it's like whatever. There's sort of like this really totally crazy. And then he got the idea that he was going to send it off to an oil painting factory in China and get them oil painted at, like 6 feet. And I don't know, it's just like, that's crazy. And it's amazing, and it's just like and he just did it, like, and this oil painting just came back, and it's incredible, and I sort of still wish I had one of those. Um, and, I just think I would say to people who do that, that stuff gets, like people who don't do that kind of stuff look at, the people who make things quickly and, are always sort of doing something new, and they kind of like poo-poo it, and
Yeah.
sometimes they'll say it's like not serious and whatever.
Right.
And it's like, there's a great tweet actually just yesterday from Patrick Collison, who's the co-founder and CEO of Stripe. And basically he was saying, like, the whole kind of speed, cost, quality that, like, pick two, he's like, that's a myth. Um,
Mhm.
like, almost always, um, going faster is also cheaper and higher quality. And, like, there are exceptions to that rule,
Right.
but, like, actually most of the time, like just getting going and doing it and figuring out how to do it quickly. Which, it does mean you can't do everything. But like finding those ways. And I think people who just make stuff, they are sort of naturally oriented towards that. And
Mm,
I think, again, they've been like, I think it's often been looked at as sort of toys, like they make
mm,
like, but I actually think it's like, it's everything. I think that,
yeah,
the opposite of what happens. I mean, we've all operated inside large organizations where you have a lot of people pushing for the longer and the higher quality, and what comes out takes longer for sure. But it most of the time is not higher quality, right? Like
right.
it's
Yeah.
and I think like I mean, there's a lot of this is, agile development is sort of built on the principle that you've got to get things in people's hands and use that to, um, uh, continue to iterate, right? It's like,
Right.
it just works. So, yeah, I don't know. I just want to be surrounded by people who make stuff.
Very true. So look in your crystal ball, like to the degree that you see anything, what's going to happen over the next 18 months?
I have no idea. I get asked this question a lot. I just, I think the thing I said about AI being sort of very nonlinear, I think like it makes it so hard to say. I mean, I could tell you some of the things I'm excited about right now
Mm.
that I think are interesting. And, I think probably I'm excited about them a little before some other people are. I
Well,
think
like what?
one of them is, I'm very excited. So, Meta introduced its latest model, Llama 3.3. Llama 3.3 is the best open source model that I've ever used. Uh,
Mhm.
and it's also reasonably small. And as a result, there's a couple companies, two of them one of them is called Grok with a Q and another is called Cerebrus. And they make these chips that allow you to run models at incredible speeds.
Mm.
And, it's always sort of felt like okay, that's kinda cool to run models at incredible speeds, but, like, the models weren't that good, so it didn't really matter. And
Yeah.
now that we have models that are like GPT 4.0 class that can
Mhm.
run at 20 times the speed, like, I just over the last month, because I mean, Llama 3.3 is only a month old. Just over the
Yeah.
last month, I've had a few situations where, like, it's fundamentally changed what was possible, because
Yeah.
now I could build sort of front end tools that processed a lot of stuff on the front end while a user was waiting. I mean, I literally had a situation where when it came out on one of these services, I moved a thing from being a 20-second processing time that someone had to wait for to being 2 seconds. And when that starts to happen, just like what I don't think people have really started to like, nobody has fully thought about what it means when, like, we've started to see what it means when, like, intelligence is essentially unmetered, right? Because like,
Yeah.
that's basically, what I mean? It's, like, essentially free from OpenAI,
Right.
Anthropic. I don't think we've really sort of started to wrap our heads around what happens when it's also instant. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think that is again, it's gonna be weird. I don't know what the answer is, right? I don't feel like I could make a prediction, but I could tell you that we are going to continue to get better open source models that can run on these super fast inference chips, and instant intelligence is going to be a very mind-blowing thing in whatever situations people figure it out. We've figured out some like, over the last month, we've had with some of our clients, we've figured out these situations where, when you are doing processing that someone has to wait on, you can sort of do it almost instantaneously, and it
Yeah.
completely changes what's possible.
And it changes behavior. And I think like an example for me was Google has so many things that have come out in the last week, but the idea that I can have Google look at my desktop and I happen to have Photoshop open just as a lark, right? And it's like, "Oh, you're working in Photoshop." I'm talking to Google. And I said, "Yeah, help me figure out how to do this thing with a smart layer that like it's a thing I do like once every 2 months and I'm always forgetting like what the thing." She goes, "Oh, click over here, do this," and hold on, I have a live chat voice. So instead of me going to YouTube and looking up the video for the 19th time to remember a process that
Yeah.
I've forgotten, it's telling me in the moment kind of what to do. And I said like, well, what else would you do to make this fancier? Just to like, and it had ideas. And so I think one of the short-term sort of things that's going to blow people's minds is that you have an AI that is able to work with you in real time and problem solve with you in real time. And again, we're not used to that. We're not essentially ready, acclimated for that kind of idea, you know?
Yeah, I would say one of the things I talk to a lot of folks about is like, I think people are too quick to focus on using AI to generate stuff
Mm, right.
because we call it generative AI,
Right.
but actually probably its ability to read is more impressive than its ability to write and probably more valuable. Uh,
Yeah.
and so, its ability to respond to you and give feedback to you and help you refine things, I think in the short term, as people are, you're building that finger feel, like that's where it's at. I
Yeah.
think like rather than trying to get it to write the poem for you or the article for you or the ad,
Right.
it's like have it react to things is like an amazing use case. And yeah, I completely agree.
Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome, amazing. I really appreciate your perspective, and I love your enthusiasm for, kind of like, hey, we have all these things that are available to us, and we can choose to take advantage if we want, you know?
Just got to play.
All right, there you go. So much to learn from the amazing Noah Brier. Thank you, Noah. Now, I love how he's thinking about AI and especially the way that he thinks about computing. We have so much to learn here in this age, and we're fortunate that we have people like Noah who are willing to help all of us figure things out. A reminder, Noah's BrXnd AI Conference will be in Los Angeles this coming February 6th. Visit BrXnd.ai to purchase tickets. Again, that's BrXnd.ai. Okay, here's wishing all of you a moment of tranquility, a moment of reflection upon the arrival of a new year. My friend James is a writer, and he wrote something I think might resonate at this point in time, at this juncture in our collective calendar. Maybe it's advice. Maybe you'll hear it as a provocation. Some potent words for the first day of a new year. James writes, wherever you are now is exactly where you're supposed to be, and you're going in the right direction. Sometimes it can be hard to remember that, and even harder to believe. Well, I hope you believe it. You take care, and thanks for listening.